Hi, folks. Welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio. And here on my channel, we talk Beatles. Lots of conversations about the Beatles. And my guest this time is someone who should be no stranger to you because he's one of my co-hosts on the Beatles talk show podcast, Things We Said Today. He's been with the show since 2014 when he and Al Sussman joined the show with me and Steve Marinucci. It's been great working with him all these years. And he's also the author of a couple of Beatle books. Got That Something, How the Beatles, I Want to Hold Your Hand Changed Everything, and also the Beatles from the Cavern to the Rooftop. He spent many years at the New York Times working in their classical department and was also their Beatle guy there anytime they needed an article written on the Beatles at the moment. So we welcome, for the first time on my YouTube channel, Allan KOZINN. Hi, Allan.
Hey, Ken, happy to be here.
The reason that we're having you on is to have a conversation on something that we discussed actually on Things We Said Today. A few years ago, we were invited to be on a panel for the 50th anniversary of the White Album. There was a symposium at Monmouth University. And we did a discussion back then on what we feel was the Beatles' peak creatively as a band. And this is always going to be a debatable topic. And Allan said something during the discussion, which I've never heard anybody really say before, although I would imagine we'll get some comments about this from people who will agree with him, that the Beatles only got better and better with every album. Whatever their newest album was better than the previous album. He's counting everything except the Let It Be album. And so I'm also figuring, Allan, that you're not counting Magical Mystery Tour because you consider that an EP with
Yeah,
singles of the year, and Yellow Submarine as well.
right.
Okay, so let's just get a general statement from you about why you feel this way. So you're actually saying then that Abbey Road was the best album that they recorded.
I suppose. I mean, it's not necessarily my favorite, although it's up there. Um, my favorite might be Pepper. But the reason that I said that at the White Album Symposium is that, right around that time, the White Album box set came out with, all the outtakes and, the remix, things like that. And up until that came out, I just would have considered Pepper to be their peak if I had thought about it at all. But reviewing the set, I think I reviewed that one for the Washington Post, and as I sat down with all the material and really went through it and everything, I began to think, actually, maybe this is better than Pepper, and so that's probably why I said it at that point. But I feel that it's a proposition I can easily justify, even including Magical Mystery Tour, Yellow Submarine, maybe, I would sort of bring that together with the same period as Magical Mystery Tour and Pepper, that whole
Hmm.
sort of, you know, think of it as a period rather than as specific albums. But, I think if you look through them, starting with Please Please Me, it does get better and better. And I can hear you thinking, but Alan, you say that Beatles for Sale isn't as good as
Are you
Fun.
reading my notes here? What is this?
And I
Actually,
think we've touched on it on the show.
that's the first thing I wrote down here because a lot of people point to Beatles for Sale as being a letdown for some of them, and mainly due to the fact that A Hard Day's Night were all original songs,
Right.
and now by the time of the end of 1964, they went back and had six cover versions, just like they did on Please Please Me and with the Beatles. So in a way, don't you look at that as being a step down for the Beatles?
Well, not necessarily, because I think there are reasons that Beatles for Sale is the way it is. And the principal reason is that they had had a really, really difficult, work intensive, no breaks year in
Hmm.
1964, and they came back from their really world tour, uh, and it was time to make an album. And I think that with everything going on, they didn't necessarily have the time to write an album full of originals that they felt ready to record. And also, the other thing about Beatles for Sale is that it's a much darker album than Hard Day's Night.
Hmm.
Hard Day's Night is up and bright and ebullient, and Beatles for Sale, I'm a loser, no reply. However, when you look at that, song for song among the originals, I think there is still a step in maturity up from the
Mhm.
songs on A Hard Day's Night. Nothing wrong with the songs on A Hard Day's Night. I mean, they're brilliant. Um, but I think that Beatles for Sale sees them taking the first steps towards what becomes Rubber Soul. That kind of um, using more acoustic guitars
Mm.
and expanding on their textures. And so in a way it was a step back because of the fewer originals, and um, a step back in the sense of it not being the incredible feel-good album that Hard Day's Night was. But of course, an album doesn't have to be a feel-good album.
Right.
So I feel that I can still justify the general statement, even with Beatles for Sale right in there as album number 4.
Mm. No, in many ways I agree with you, but I know that with some fans, the original songs will always have a higher status to them than cover versions, as
Yeah,
great as the cover versions were.
but there's an interesting thing about the original song thing, and this is one of the things that was to me sort of like a big freak out revelation in Mark Lewison's book. Um, and that's I always thought of them as Lennon and McCartney songwriters, and that was something they really were devoted to doing, as well as being a pop band. And Mark basically explained that no, they mainly were a pop band. They were a little embarrassed about their own compositions. They were doing them so that they would have stuff that nobody else had, but they weren't really focused on it. And what changed that was the fact that George Martin signed them, as we didn't know, because of Ardmore and Beechwood wanting to publish one of the originals. And I
Mm.
think the fact that they got their contract on the basis of the originals sort of changed their attitude towards originals. And they, began realizing, okay, people really like these. They like having, Please Please Me be the single, or Love Me Do, rather than How Do You Do It,
Right.
because it was theirs. And I think that Beatles for Sale was really only a couple of years after they had sort of changed their mindset from we're a rockin' band and we play, Carole King and we play our stuff and we play various things, to hey, we're the band that does the Lennon McCartney stuff.
Mhm.
And so really, with the Beatles and Please Please Me, um, had basically the same kind of makeup as Beatles for Sale, with a combination of covers and originals. Hard Day's Night was in a way revolutionary, because it was all originals. And yet at those sessions, they also recorded the stuff that came out on the EP, around the Long Tall Sally EP.
Right.
And those were mostly covers, at least half covers.
Mm.
Um, and then, and also keep in mind that when they went on the BBC, um, they were playing, excuse me, they were playing a lot of covers. I mean, they played, I think, something like 36 songs that they never recorded for EMI.
That's right.
So part of them also sort of enjoyed their status as a cover band, that brought something of their own to those covers. So when you look at Beatles for Sale, in light of what we learned from Mark's book, it's hard to know whether, going back, was a letdown, or it was getting them back to the formula that they originally liked for albums 1 and 2. You know, there are probably several things true in there. People are complicated.
Yeah, but also, like you said, maybe if their schedule wasn't as busy as it was in 1964, we would have had another album of all original material.
Right.
And
And if you think about it, they could have done Bad to Me, It's For You. They could have done Love of the Love. They could, they had other songs, but I think they felt that they were beyond those, or the ones they had given away, they'd given away.
hmm,
Mm, So they had some stuff, but for whatever reasons, I mean, we'd have to ask them, why on Beatles for Sale did you go back, and see what they'd have to say, and then the two of them that are around, and
yeah.
and really, I'm not sure Ringo has an opinion on that. You'd probably have to ask Paul.
Well, of the millions of questions we'd love to ask Paul or Ringo that may not be up high up on the chain there, but yeah, but still, I mean, I agree with you about the compositions getting better, certainly much more personal. Lennon was always good at relationships that weren't working with the girl with a girl, even early on.
Mhm.
You know, but yeah, I agree with you there. I just wish sometimes that fans would have a greater respect for the cover versions because I think they did a marvelous job on all of them, really.
Mhm.
But for a lot of them, still, they'll always have a lower status, unfortunately, to the originals. And I'd like to see that change. Especially when you listen to Live at the BBC. I mean, there's proof there with all those other songs that they didn't release on Parlophone EMI, all the other songs they could have released on their albums. They
Right.
could have had 3 more albums worth of covers.
Absolutely. Yeah, we should possibly point your viewers to our Things We Said Today episode, where we each put together a BBC album as if, that was going to be an EMI album.
Yeah, if you could pick one album. I mean, if you were to put together one album of the best of the BBC, what would it be?
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you look at Help as being that much of a progression going from Beatles for Sale to that?
Um, Maybe not a huge progression, but it still is, if you're considering original songs as a measure, um, it's certainly, much more. I mean, except for Dizzy Miss Lizzie,
Mm-hmm.
it's all original songs.
And Act Naturally.
Oh, and Act Natural. And you're getting things like, John later telling us that the title song was his actual cry for help,
Mm-hmm.
which in a way brings it a little back to Beatles for Sale period. There's some disarray going on among them mentally, because of all the pressures and everything going on in their lives off the stage. So Help, I think, comes out of Beatles for Sale really well in that sense. Let's look at it. And you've got to hide your love away. You see the sort of Dylan influence, but you see that a little bit in I'm a Loser too.
Right.
Um, you've got more from George, who we haven't heard from since with the Beatles, I think.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think in a way, I still think that the um, original songs are really a step up. Certainly, the songs for the film are really all great songs.
Hmm.
And when you look on side two, I mean, I'm conditioned by the fact that I grew up in America and the albums were a bit different. But, I look at the British one and I see, I've just seen a face sort of stuck here,
Yeah.
near the bottom. And, it's totally lost on the English album. And yet it's a very strong album opener on the
Mm-hmm.
American Rubber Soul. And I think that in a way we don't hear the song the same when we listen to it on Help as when you first put down the needle and you hear that guitar riff. you
Mm,
know, that puts that song in your mind in a really different way. And I think you value it more. I mean, yeah, we got, in fact, two Harrisons here.
right.
Uh, there were some things like, excuse me, I'm not crazy about Tell Me What You See. Um, yeah. And even really George's You Like Me Too Much. Not the most incredible thing they did, but you also have to realize that when I say I'm not crazy about this, I'm talking about in the context of the Beatles record. I mean, it's still better than most people could do,
Right.
in a day of the week.
And
So,
yeah, it's important what you said about I've Just Seen a Face, because certainly song placement is very important on an album, and any song that leads off an album, that gives it prominence. It's the first thing you're going to hear. And also, for that matter, songs that end albums too. And
mhm,
the Beatles were so good, and George Martin was so good at knowing what to place first, you know, on the British albums.
right.
And yeah, it's the way those songs were sequenced made a lot of sense. Although I've often said that the Beatles music was so good that we would have gotten used to any order of any of these songs. But still, yeah. Are
Yeah,
you more a
all the
fan?
albums should now come on shuffle play.
Hey, when the songs are strong, that's all that matters most of all. But Beatles albums, once you got used to the order, it was an experience. It wasn't just an enjoyable listen. It was
Right,
more than just that.
right.
So yeah, were you more a fan of the American Rubber Soul?
Um, I'm on the fence about that. I mean, a lot of the time I am. I definitely can make an argument justifying the American Rubber Soul as more coherent than the British Rubber Soul. Um, Although, oddly enough, the American Rubber Soul doesn't have Drive My Car, which is the kind of song that they sort of base the title on, the Rubber Soul, Plastic Soul kind of
Hmm.
thing. Drive My Car was supposed to be a kind of a soulful uh,
R&B like
rap.
song. Yeah.
Yeah, and that gave it its title. So the American album doesn't have that, and that is a slight conceptual problem if you're thinking about things like the title of the album. But even with Drive My Car There, a lot of people didn't really make the connection. Um, so yeah, I like the American one because, partly because it opens with I've Just Seen a Face, which I love. I mean, I love the way it opens the album, and the fact that it seems a much more acoustic album than the British one.
Hmm.
Um, and that seems to me to make a certain amount of sense. I mean, it was all 1965 stuff, so um, there's some juggling that you can maybe justify because we're still within the same period. I mean, this is when they were still putting out two albums a year.
Mm.
Later it was one. So if it was in the one album a year period, who knows? Maybe I've Just Seen a Face would have ended up opening up Rubber Soul. Who
Mm.
knows?
All right.
I like the American Rubber Soul more than I like a lot of the other American albums.
I'll agree with you there. One of the few adjustments that I had to make in reverting over to the British albums when I did, and I only had a few British albums vinyl um, in the 70s and 80s. Once the Beatles albums came out on CD, and I had to get used to it that way. One of the biggest adjustments was Rubber Soul. So used to hearing it with I've
Yeah,
Just Seen a Face.
right, right.
But here's my main argument in in what you were saying about Beatles albums getting better and better. And if you believe, and there's nothing wrong with saying you think Abbey Road is their best. Certainly in recent decades, a lot of people have been pointing to Revolver as being possibly their greatest album, their greatest leap creatively, going from album to album. And not to put, all the praise on Revolver, but if you were to combine Revolver with Sergeant Pepper, that
Mhm.
whole period, there's so much change that took place in the Beatles songs, in the way they were recorded, so much advancement. going on, it's easy to look at that period, whether you just want to single out Revolver or whether you want to combine it with Sergeant Pepper, throw in Penny Lane, Strawberry Fields Forever in the middle of it all. How can anyone not look at that period as being their peak period? And, just to give you a few examples, and I think we brought this up on things we said today, but if you were to take a look at Lennon's weirdest stuff, you'd have to point to like Tomorrow Never Knows, the more psychedelic stuff like I'm Only Sleeping in Rain, and then from there, Strawberry Fields, A Day in the Life, which I know was co-written with Paul, and I Am the Walrus, and that's all 66, 67.
Mhm.
Talk about Paul and all the advancement he was making with classical music. Really, you got to start with Yesterday, so that's 65, but then you've got Eleanor Rigby, For No One, going into She's Leaving Home, which John had a lot to do with the writing too. Um, and then you've got all the Indian stuff that George was doing,
Right.
starting with adding the sitar on Norwegian Wood, but then Love You Too, 66, Revolver, Within You Without You, what a masterpiece that is.
Mhm.
It's 66 and 67, that whole period. And
Right.
then to go with all that, all that was going on, all the changes in the recording, all the different sounds they made, how everything was recorded with microphone placement, all the different sounds that came out of the studio then. So much was happening in 66, 67. Not that it wasn't happening before or after, but how can anyone look at any other period as being creatively? I'm not saying because you can like other songs more than this period, but I'm just talking about from a creative standpoint, that period.
Mm,
I just want to know your views on
yeah.
that.
Yeah, that, 66, 67 was a huge leap. And in fact, actually, that was the problem I had with George's comment in Anthology, where he said that he looked at Rubber Soul and Revolver as part one and part two. I see Revolver and Pepper as part one and part two,
Hmm.
because they're more of a of a feather, let's say, the electronic stuff. But it seems to me like, on Revolver, they're beginning to experiment with this stuff and they're beginning to, give George some room to experiment with Indian music. But that sort of points to and culminates in Sergeant Pepper, where I think it's, now they have a better idea of how to do it. You
Hmm.
know, I mean, it's great, the tape loops in Tomorrow Never Knows and that kind of thing. But yet, look at the difference between that and the tape component of Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite, where they recorded a calliope and cut it up in pieces and threw it
Right.
up in the air and then assembled it, and what you get is a really wild track, uh,
Uh-huh.
far wilder than the stuff on Tomorrow Never Knows, where it's tape loops played with speed and different kind of things. um, and then you have something like A Day in the Life. I kind of think that during the Revolver period they weren't really ready to conceive of, let alone do, something like A Day in the Life. Um, and so I see what you're saying, that, you don't necessarily see that kind of leap in creativity on, I guess the White Album, Abbey Road, and Let It Be.
Hmm.
Um, hmm. I think on the White Album, you do see some of it. I mean, in Revolution 9, that would never have been on a Beatles album before that.
Right.
Um, and also I think on the White Album they were also after something else. They were basically showing whether this was what they had in mind or not. But when you look at it, they are showing their mastery of basically every style of pop and some beyond pop.
Hmm.
There's country tunes, there's folky tunes, there's Beach Boys, there's, blues rock. I mean, I'd be hard pressed to think of a pop genre that was current at the time. So obviously, there's no hip hop. Yeah,
Yeah.
um, I can't think of a genre that was current at the time that they didn't address there and show that they, owned it. I mean, even something like Honey Pie,
Hmm.
it really is phenomenal the amount of styles they commanded on that album. So in that sense, you could see that as a leap beyond um, the Revolver Pepper thing. The Revolver Pepper thing was really a creative explosion of their own stuff. And maybe you could look at the White Album with its command of all these different styles as maybe a stopping point and looking back at the history of pop music and, what led to them. And here they are, presenting the totality of pop music as the Beatles in
Hmm.
original songs. But that's an accomplishment, and it shows a facility with all those styles that I'm not sure we knew they had. We knew they could do country, we knew they could do rock, we knew they could do psychedelic stuff. But the White Album goes really beyond anything. So that then brings us to Let It Be.
Hmm. Well, before we get there, first of all, I just want to say I agree with everything you just said. And many is the time I've said the White Album is the most eclectic album that's ever been released by any artist.
Yeah,
Um, but also, if you take a look at what they were doing prior to the White Album, I mean, you talk about music that's all over the place. Look at Sergeant Pepper. I
that's
mean, you've
true.
got psychedelic stuff there like Lucy in the Sky and Mr. Kite and A Day in the Life. And, how far removed is Honey Pie from When I'm 64? It's dance hall, that 1930s style from McCartney.
That's true.
I mean, the music is all over the place.
Oh, it
On
is.
Sergeant Pepper and certainly on Revolver.
Mhm.
So they just went a little further, I think, and they had the room to do it with two albums,
Right.
with the White Album. But um, before we talk about, Let It Be and all, there is such a thing as innovation and being groundbreaking with everything that they were doing through Sergeant Pepper in '67. But isn't just mastering so many different musical genres, isn't that innovation in and of itself?
Hmm.
I mean, you can talk all you want about all the different sounds the Beatles got out of the studio and how everything was mixed and recorded, and all the stuff Jeff Emerick was bringing to the table with the Beatles and everything, and tape loops and adjusting speeds on their voices and all kinds of things that they were doing. But just the fact that within this body of work of the White Album, there's all these different styles of music. Who else was doing anything like that? And as well as the Beatles, for that matter. So why isn't that just as innovative as anything else that they've done or groundbreaking?
Um, I think I'm the one arguing that each album gets more groundbreaking. So I'm already saying the White Album is in a way more groundbreaking than the previous stuff. So I agree. It is.
Oh, okay. So,
I think actually, in a way, part of what was groundbreaking there was not so much that they showed their command of all these different styles, but that they also made all those songs theirs. I mean, Honey Pie is a great 1920s track,
hmm,
but it's also very clearly a Beatles track. It's not a Beatles track if you think of Beatles tracks being like, I Want to Hold Your Hand or She Loves You. But by now, we're used to them not necessarily sticking to their normal instrumentation or what was originally the normal instrumentation. We're used to them not sticking to a rock and roll or country or folk style. So yeah, I mean, I agree that is a kind of innovation for a number of ways, and I think that when I got to the White Album, when the box set came out, I began to realize that you know there is just a spectacular array of stuff here,
hmm,
and much as I like the Pepper Revolver period maybe the most in some ways in terms of if I'm going to reach for an album and just take one and play it because I've got 40 minutes,
Hmm.
it might be Pepper. Um, but I think hearing the box set gave me a new appreciation for what was on the White Album.
Mm. Sometimes I think maybe some of us may be confused with creative peak if you're thinking about all the advancements and the innovations the Beatles were doing technology wise, as opposed to songwriting wise. And
Right.
certainly songwriting, they still can continue to grow and progress.
Mhm.
And so, you know, that's where I agree with you where the White Album is concerned.
Yeah.
Although, look, all these other compositions before the White Album were phenomenal in many ways. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
And if you look at technology, you also see a progression all the way through. I mean, from 2-track on Please Please Me to
Mm.
2-track on most of With the Beatles, but they had 4-track for one track plus the single. Um, then 4-track for a while, and by the time of Rubber Soul, they're beginning to do those subsidiary mixes so that they can free up some tracks.
Hmm.
But they're not doing it on every single song, and the same with Revolver, but with Pepper, they took that. Okay, we only have 4 tracks, but we need to do something. I mean, they took that technique far beyond where they had been.
Sure.
And then with the White Album, it starts on 4-track, they end up with 8-track. So, that gives them a new sort of license to do a lot more stuff because, they could still make the subsidiary mixes if they wanted, even with 8 tracks,
Hmm.
you know. So, yeah, the technology as well improved. And I think that in a way helped them improve because there was no longer a limitation on their uh, vision of what they wanted to do, or there was a limitation, but less of a limitation than there had been.
Hmm.
So yeah, I agree about the technology.
Yeah. Okay. So move on to Let It Be. You were about to
Right.
talk about that.
Okay. So with Let It Be, okay, it's a step back in a way, in the sense that the step backness of it was written into the description of the project.
Hmm.
Is we want to make an album where we learn the material and we play it live in the studio, and we're not editing and we're not overdubbing and we're not fixing. We just need to be able to play it live, and that's partly because the original plan was to do a TV special where they're filming some of the rehearsals and showing us, at how they're getting it together, and then the end was going to be a concert where they play all this stuff. Now, had that plan actually taken place, I kind of think that they would have taken the concert film and the concert multi-tracks and done what absolutely every band does with their concert recordings, and that's go in and fix this and fix that and sweeten this and sweeten
Mm.
that. The Beatles themselves had done it with the Shea Stadium special,
Hmm.
you know. Um, so there is that possibility, but I think they wanted it to be that they play it live as close as can be. Well, to say you're playing it live, even adding Billy Preston, who wasn't originally in the plan,
Hmm.
so they have a keyboard player. um, we're talking about them going back to their original instrumentation as of with the Beatles and Please Please Me, with perhaps Paul playing more piano than he would have done in those days
Mm.
on a couple of songs at least. Um, and so, yeah, there's going to be a sense of stepping back after you see the instrumentation on the album and the multi-tracking on the albums getting more and more and more expansive from Rubber Soul through the White Album. Um, so the step back aspect is really that, and that's it's kind of written into the project. So can't really criticize that except if you want to say, but why would they do that? You know, but everyone has the right to sit back and retrench for a bit sometimes. I mean, a lot of people do that.
Hmm.
And you look at the songs, um, you know, there's still some great stuff on it. I can't really fault any of the songs. Um, they're perhaps a little more straightforward because they were going to be performed live, and that you had to write them in a way you could do that.
Hmm.
But there's some great stuff. Um, but there were also some attitude problems during it. In the beginning, they all had agreed to do this, or they wouldn't have been doing it. And then when they got there, George wasn't that interested. John wasn't that interested. Even Ringo, because Ringo had to go start filming Magic Christian in February.
Hmm.
Even Ringo, when you listen to the discussions about, what are we going to do about the live show, he's really not that keen. And, the impression we have of Ringo is that he's keen to do everything. I think we've all sort of adopted the John
Sure.
Lovett's character from Saturday Night Live, with I'm just happy to be here, which is a little unfair, but, he seems always the most agreeable. And
Yeah.
in this case, he was a little less,
Hmm.
Um, but so it's a step back in a certain way. Um, the songs are great. Maybe they're not as ambitious as some of the ones on the White Album, because they're not trying to do what they were doing on the White Album. They're not trying to show that they have command of the entire musical universe. They're
Hmm.
doing an album that's going to be a live show. So,
But
and
there's some similarity there I've always found between the White Album and Let It Be, in that, Let It Be is supposed to be a back to basics album. And for the most part, I think the Beatles wanted to do something that was a direct change of what they were doing in 67, with so much layering of production on Sgt. Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour and all that. They
yeah,
wanted it to be basically the band. And yes, you have the exceptions with Good Night with an orchestra on that, or the occasional instrument like harpsichord on Piggies, and you've got Revolution Number 9, which is, in a world to itself. But
mhm,
for the most part, the White Album was more of a stripped down, this is the band as it is, with a lot of songs being just one or two of them.
mhm.
But still, I mean, I kind of see a similarity between the White Album and Let It Be in that regard. But yeah, in terms of the material, yeah, the Beatles are musically all over the place with the White Album.
Yeah. Um, with Let It Be, that actually came out of discussions about how to promote the White Album. And
Hmm.
before they even came up with the idea of Let It Be, they were talking about doing a couple of shows in December '68 that were supposed to promote the White Album, which would have meant that they would have been learning some of the White Album stuff to play live. And so, your observation that it's more back to basics kind of works with that plan. There are
Hmm.
a number of songs on that that they could have played live. John played your blues live with, the Dirty Mac or whatever, on the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus. So that was definitely instant live track if they wanted to learn that. There's not a lot of fancy stuff there.
Yeah.
Uh, and quite a lot of them really could have, and then Let It Be evolved into something else, like let's do this except with new material. Um, so yeah, there is a certain link between the White Album and Let It Be, I think.
Yeah. And I've said a few times that it's kind of a shame that when you watch Let It Be, and we love the Apple Rooftop performance, but they only did 5 songs. And
Right.
even when they finished one of those songs, they repeat it later. There's certain songs they did more than once. So you kind of wonder, even though the concert was stopped after 42 minutes,
Hmm.
how many more songs could they have done anyway? But if they had rehearsed the White Album stuff, that could have been a phenomenal concert,
That's true.
what the original plan was for Let It Be.
That's right. That's right. They should have thought of that. But I think that at that point they were trying to just get live takes of their new songs, And so it really needed to be two concerts because the next day they just went down to the basement to record the songs with piano and acoustic guitar.
Hmm.
Maybe they could have done on the rooftop if it was the summer or the spring, but it was freezing up there, you know.
Yeah.
Not to mention, the roof couldn't have held the piano.
Yeah.
They've talked about how you know, and other people, you know, who were involved in it talked about how they had to reinforce the roof just to have that many people up there, you know, and you know, with the camera crew and all that stuff. So a piano, I'm not sure it would have gone falling through into the next floor.
Yeah. Not only that, but I really couldn't hear the softer songs being done on the roof.
No,
You
probably
know,
not.
I couldn't hear two of us, something like that.
You know, they're getting a really good take and an airplane goes by.
Yeah.
It's not gonna happen.
Okay, so tell me your thoughts about Abbey Road, since that
Okay.
must be, in your estimation, their best album, or creatively in that regard.
I think in a way I can probably justify that on the basis of, for one thing, on the basis of one of the cheats that they came up with, which was all the medley stuff on side two, which was really, you know, as they've admitted themselves, are really unfinished songs that
Hmm.
they strung together. But they strung them together in a way that really works well, you know, and it has that, you know, whole sort of, you know, valedictory ending of, you know, them each taking solos, including Ringo. You know, that's something that was never done on a Beatles album before, you know, dueling solos
Hmm.
with all guitarists doing it. I mean, kind of wish that Paul also had a bass solo in there because, you know, his bass lines could be solos as they were.
True. Yeah.
Um, and but you know, he's a really good guitarist, and that's what he wanted to do. And maybe maybe they didn't want him to have two solos. Why should Paul have two and we all have one? I'm sure Ringo would have surrendered his to Paul, but they didn't. The others didn't. The others wanted him to have his little moment there.
Hmm.
But that's something, you know, the Beatles as a jam group didn't happen on any album until that, and that's after the medleys where you're taking on this whole tour of weird little characters, me, Mr. Mustard, and Polythene Pam, and you know, they even rewrote Mean Mr. Mustard, where his sister was originally Shirley, and now it's
Hmm.
Pam to match Polythene Pam. Um, you know, you have George Harrison with two incredible songs. Um, Now he's stepped away from the Indian thing. He's back in conventional pop music and writes two songs that are two of the best songs on the album. You
Hmm.
know, in which album, you know, even Revolver, where he has three, um, do you say that, okay, George's contributions are really among the best in the album? You maybe can say it on the White Album because he's got four, and
Right.
one is While My Guitar Gently Weeps, which is like, I think, one of the Beatles' all-time great songs.
Sure.
Um, but still, you know, you would rarely single out George's things as, you know, better than most of the rest of the album.
Hmm.
Sure, I'd say they're better than most of it, you know, but they are definitely up there and absolutely highlights. Um, you have um, I Want You, She's So Heavy. I mean, that's a very experimental track. You've got the white noise sort of layering and layering and layering until it almost drowns the song out, and then it's suddenly cut off.
Hmm.
You know, the end and her, you know, sort of isn't the end because of Her Majesty. You know,
Right.
so you have a mistake. You know, basically a bit of tape that was stuck on the end of the reel, and the Beatles heard it on the playback and said, "Yeah, leave it there. We like it."
Hmm.
It also was cut off because it was in the medley, and
Right.
you have this weird, you know, weird little music theory thing going on where um, "I Want You" cuts off on what would be the the dominant of the song, the 5 chord, and it
Mhm.
resolves to the 1 chord in Here Comes the Sun, because they're in the same key, you know. And then Her Majesty also is cut off at the dominant. And if you play it over, it resolves to the 1st chord of Come Together.
Uh-huh.
If you play the album in a loop and it continues, all those things resolve that are
Mm.
left in midair. Um, Now,
The
I'd
Beatles
love,
weren't thinking that, you know that.
yeah, I'd love to say that the Beatles did that as a brilliant thing for music theory fans, but we know better than that.
Uh-huh.
But here's the thing about the Beatles. They were even able to make accidents work for them.
No. The With the Beatles, the only thing that mattered was the end result.
Mhm.
And if they broke all the rules to get it, fine, whatever it took.
Yep.
But how do you feel about John Lennon's comments? And I know that there are some fans who are so influenced by what he said that, a lot of what he considered unfinished songs would be garbage. You
Yeah.
know, they just used them and try to find a way to string them all together. They're not really complete songs. He really downplayed
Yeah.
those type of songs. How do you
Yeah.
feel about that?
Um, he did. But as Paul has, I believe, pointed out, it's the same as the Brian put us in suit story. You know, Paul is saying, in both cases, I didn't see John objecting to it at the time. John
Hmm.
participated in making the recordings of those partial songs. He participated in changing, Shirley to Pam. You know, he did what was required of him to do. He didn't nix it. He could have nixed it. He could have said, "There's no way we're putting out these half songs." And if he had said that, all Paul would have had to say to him is, "So tell me about Happiness is a Warm Gun," because
Right.
because that's
Hmm.
exactly the same. A Day in the Life is the same too. You know, those were, maybe not snippets of songs, but
I've
it,
got a feeling.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think I think John made a big deal about it on Abbey Road, but I think it was kind of a rhetorical, gesture that he was doing. I mean, he was complaining about, something, and this is what it turned out to be. But I don't really take that uh, criticism that seriously. I mean, yeah, I recognize that they're all partial songs, but they work together really well. And Paul did a lot of that in his solo career after that, probably because this worked so well. You
Hmm.
know, he kind of realized, the medley on Red Rose Speedway, even songs like Another Day, you
Uh-huh.
know, that was 2 songs.
Uncle
One
Albert, Albert Halsey, all these,
have
Band on the Run.
right, 3 songs. Yeah, yeah. He did it quite a lot. He made that technique work for him with some really good stuff. And so John saying it is like he's adopting a purist view that, it's not really a legitimate song unless I've written it start to finish and it has bridge and it has,
Hmm.
all the components. But, I think the medley on side 2 really works well, and the way it goes into, carry that weight in the end especially, when the original CDs came out, or maybe it was the 2009 set, and I was doing an A/B comparison with one of the Mobile Fidelity half-speed masters of
Hmm.
Abbey Road. And in the end, I mean, I just actually thought the half speed master sounded a lot better, and maybe not a lot better, but it sounded better. So I took the CD off and I just played side 2 of the half speed master. And there was something in playing that side that struck me as so incredibly beautiful, incredibly accomplished, and because it was the last album, incredibly tragic, you know,
Hmm.
that I hadn't really, it was a feeling I hadn't had with any of their other albums. Of course, their other albums were not the last one. So this,
Mhm.
we're talking about the section where there are the solos and vocal harmonies, orchestration. It just was like, how how could they possibly reach this level and say, yeah, that's enough? you know I mean, I just wonder what the next thing would have been. Then maybe it would have been just a plain acoustic album. Who knows? But I think it was the peak in that sense. I mean, so partly what I'm saying is I'm thinking of Abbey Road as the peak because of a gut reaction I had listening to a half speed master. So,
Hmm.
but
Yeah,
I
that's the
mm,
thing. You don't really know. Sometimes there's a part of me that feels that they knew going into this would be their last album. And Ringo has said, actually, he actually said we didn't go into it knowing it was going to be the last song or the last album. And then more recently, he said we kind of knew that it was going to
yeah,
be our last album. So, and then once you find out about the other things that happened later on that year, where they're having meetings and you know
yeah,
they could have continued. We don't really know. Maybe John doing Live Peace in Toronto was the deciding factor. He felt, I can do this on my own. It was a great feeling to do this by myself. There's so many reasons why they broke up, and it's extremely complicated. But getting back to that all, half finished songs, John did that too in his solo career.
mhm,
And not as much as Paul, but eh, from listening to the Lost Lennon tapes, there were what they called what they composites or prototypes of certain songs like Mind Games or just like Starting Over. They were song fragments that he strung together.
I see.
So, it's very hypocritical of John to say those things. Sometimes I feel that if it's an album like, especially Sergeant Pepper, he always downplayed Sergeant Pepper.
Great.
There's a quote from him: "What does anybody remember from Sergeant Pepper? A day in the life. That's all I remember."
Mhm.
I think he felt that way because Paul got so much credit for the songs on Sergeant Pepper and for the idea of Sergeant Pepper. Maybe it was a jealousy thing, my own personal opinion, but that's why, and he shouldn't have felt that way because John had a lot to do with Sergeant Pepper and the songs on there, including some of the songs that you attribute to Paul.
Yeah.
You know,
John would get down on things that he had been up on at the time or whatever. But I was just thinking as you were talking about the meetings and stuff. Listen to this. John is really down on Paul because Paul is sitting there at these meetings saying, "Let's get in the bus and go out and play some gigs."
hmm,
We should get back on stage and do it. And John said, "Oh, no, no, no." And then he comes back after Live Peace in Toronto and he's, "Wow, I can go out on stage and play live, and it's a lot of fun. I love it." But then a week later, and breaks up with the Beatles because partly because that's what he wants to do when
hmm,
that's what Paul was pushing the whole time. It's a very complicated, fraught period trying to sort out some sort of logic, and it's hard to do because we're also talking about um, the interactions between very strong personalities who have been locked up together for over a decade, and they all sort of, or at least John particularly, wanted to break free of it.
hmm,
um, and in a way, maybe Paul wanted to break free of it too, because if you think about it, John says, "Yeah, I'm leaving the group," and Paul says basically, "Okay." you know, and then they get together in January to record "I Me Mine" for Let It Be.
hmm.
And that session ran all night. And apparently, from things I've read, um, a lot of the time when they stopped and took a break and were chatting, it was like, "So, do you guys think John was serious or not? What do you think? What are we gonna do?" And by then, Paul had already started the McCartney album. So he seems to have resigned himself, or maybe he was in a certain way eager. I mean, he talks a lot about, having a nervous breakdown and, or being close to a nervous breakdown because of this and feeling out of a job and all that stuff. But, he was forging ahead anyway. And, maybe he had just had enough of, John's ups and downs. He never says that. We don't hear much about it, but
Or maybe he was doing the recordings from McCartney as a backup, just
yeah,
in case John wasn't going to return. He had to have something fairly soon. You can't go too long without having product.
right.
So you don't know. It's so absolutely complicated to get into the minds of the four of them. And John always, kind of gave the impression that he could change his mind on a dime.
That's
So
right.
how do you know how John really felt? And but I know from doing the show with you on things we said today that, once Paul felt that John was serious about this, he was convinced of it.
Hmm.
And he went forward thinking that.
Right.
So, but if he's talking to George and Ringo on January 3rd, 1970, during I Me Mine, asking, what do you think? Maybe
Yeah.
he wasn't sure.
Yeah. I mean, isn't there a possibility that when John got back from Denmark, the four of them could have sat down and said, okay, so we know you quit in September, but how you feeling now? You know, because look, George, I mean, George went on to the Howard Smith show in New York
Right.
on the 1st of May, 1970, and he was absolutely sure that they would get back together. He
Hmm.
just, everyone's just being a little bitchy, you know, but, he seemed to think it would happen. So who knows?
And in the meantime, John's putting out singles on his own, and he's
Yep.
working on Instant Karma right at the beginning of 1970.
Hmm.
So you might be thinking he's only thinking solo here, him
Right.
on his own. And he's got all these ideas of things he wants to do with Yoko on an artistic level, and it's to try to figure out everything and piece it all together. You can get a little bit closer to
Yeah.
the full picture, but you'll never have the full picture, no matter what, unless you're one of them.
Of course, and it can drive you crazy if you really try and figure out, what the future could have been beyond Abbey Road if they had, and how they could have come together again. It's, what, it didn't happen. So there it is.
Hmm. But as I've said many times, they all had the most successful solo careers of all time, so they all did well,
Yeah.
and they put out so much more music on their own. At least in my case, I didn't feel that tremendous a loss because, I mean, you just look at 1970.
Right.
You got two albums from Ringo, one from Paul, one from John, a triple album from George. How much more can you ask for from them? And so much music was coming at me all at once that I didn't really feel like, this was the end. They were still coming
Right.
up with great product, great songs. And
Yeah. Yeah. And you felt at that time, in any way, that there was always the possibility, maybe they're just getting the solo stuff out of their system and they'll come back together again. But, in terms of, you were mentioning about, whether or not they thought it was their last album, Abbey
mm,
Road, and we've talked about this before, and uh, I always was under the impression that they did know because of a chat I had with John Kurlander, who was, I think, a tape op at that point, but worked on the project, and he told me, very clearly that they thought of it as their swan song, that they wanted to call it Abbey Road, yes, because of Jeff Emmerich's cigarettes, but it also represented the peak, of the world. And they were basically saying, this is our last album, but we're going out at our peak. And he talked about how they were, talking about being flown to Mount Everest to take the cover photo.
mm,
And, there's always been a lot of resistance to that narrative, even though someone who was there, basically said it and sounded quite sure about it. One of the things I'm doing, as part of the project, the McCartney Legacy project, is I'm making sure that I have absolutely every one of Paul's interviews that I have on my hard drive. And
mm.
so things that I have on cassette and open reel, I'm listening to now. And I ran into one, and I forget which interview it was, but someone asked him about, Everest as the title, and were you going to go to Everest and all that. And he said something like, well, yeah, we talked about a lot of things, but I think in this case it might be, some junior engineer heard it and got all excited about it. And at this point, nobody John Kurlander wasn't saying a lot about this to anyone. I mean, he said it to me, he said it to Lewison in his research for the recording sessions book. But it's kind of funny that Paul says a junior engineer, and that could very it probably was
Yes.
Kurlander he was thinking of. So that sort of added a little bit more for me about, okay, maybe John Kurlander was under that impression and heard that, and they said it and all that, but he wouldn't have known how serious they were or weren't about it. So that's just like another little tidbit of, in that file of, did they or didn't they know it was their swan song?
Right.
It sure
And
sounds
yet,
like it,
if
with the
yeah,
end and the solos and,
yeah, I remember saying that to you at our show. Why would they call the song "The End"? But if they were thinking this was their last album, why would they have that meeting where John is proposing that they make another album and it's divided evenly between John, Paul, and George?
that's right.
You know,
That's right. I mean, they were really trying to come up with a way to go forward there, you
and if
know.
anything, I find that fascinating because at least it recognizes, at least on the part of John, that there was a problem here with George not being recognized as much as
Mhm.
the others with his new material.
Right.
So, yeah. And, it's often said, and I kind of, I personally think it's true that nobody loved being a Beatle more than Paul.
That
I
could
mean,
be.
he loved those guys. They all loved each other. And let's face it, you're part of the biggest band in the world. You've got the security of being in the biggest band in the world. You want that to continue, apart from the fact that these were his friends, his brothers. I do believe he had a breakdown. You know, I don't, I think he wasn't quite sure where John stood,
Right.
when he made the announcement. But, it's a complete other world when all of a sudden you've got to be doing everything by yourself when you've relied on the others. And
Yeah.
yes, there were times when in their solo careers they paired up occasionally, but for the most part, most of what they did, they had to do by themselves,
Mhm.
especially Paul in the 70s,
Mhm.
apart from relying on George Martin here and there and, Jeff Emmerich. But as far as the other Beatles, no,
Right.
they weren't with him. But it's a fascinating thing, and part of the reason it's fascinating is because we'll never have all the answers.
Right. Right.
We can get closer, but we'll never have all the answers.
Mhm.
But you were just mentioning the McCartney legacy, and just in case there are some people watching this who aren't familiar with our podcast, tell the folks what this whole project has been because it's several volumes that
Right.
you're working on Paul's solo career.
Yeah. So I'm working with a guy named Adrian Sinclair, who is British, and in his sort of day job, he's a film editor for TV, and I think he's done some films too. And he came up with this idea. Originally the idea was really a glorified sessionography in a way. It was like, why can't we do for Paul stuff what Mark did for the Beatles stuff?
Mm,
There's a lot of reasons why you can't, um, including not being, let into Paul's archive to play with his tapes. Not that we even, tried. Uh, as we were collecting material for that, it kind of evolved into something else. I mean, um, Mark Lewison, to a big degree, convinced us both that we should do it as a biography, not just a sessionography. And
hmm
so we wanted the sessionography to be a big part of it. And it is, when he's recording an album, we have, session by session information about what he was doing and how he was doing it. And, we talked to engineers, we talked to other players, we got as much info as we can, given that Paul isn't talking to us. I mean, Paul doesn't like biographies of himself and the Beatles. And
Why is that?
I don't know. Uh, in all these tapes I've been transferring, I've been listening to his reasons why he doesn't like biographies, but it's. I think he's taken the attitude that you can never really get the full truth. You can't even necessarily really remember the full truth accurately yourself if you were there. So a biography is going to be even further, and why participate? So I've interviewed Paul over the years for the Times a few times, and I've had some interaction with him, and I have those interviews. But I also have now, what's on my hard drive now as I'm working through this transferring project. I've got something like close to 700 Paul McCartney interviews just sitting on a drive. I haven't even looked through the CDs yet. This is just stuff I had files of, electronic files of, or am transferring from cassettes and open reels. There's a whole drawer full of interview CDs too, some of which will be, overlap, but I know that there's some stuff in the drawer that I haven't got in the 700s. So yeah, and you listen to Paul, and he'll say things that are just factually wrong. We know they're factually wrong, and he just, either remembers it wrong, or this is a more convenient way to remember it, or this is his reinterpretation of what it is. So the fact that he's not cooperating with us doesn't really bother us that much. It would be great if he would, because there are some questions that I think, people haven't asked, that it would be good to know. But the book is fundamentally, I mean, to get back to what it is, it starts with the breakup of the Beatles and Paul going up to Scotland and, getting ready to do the McCartney album. It does have to backtrack through the last year or so of the Beatles, because we need to explain why that's coming to an end, which is complicated, as you know, and there's a lot of legal stuff and business stuff, and we try actually to sort that out in a way that people can understand. And when I say people, I mean starting with us, because I've read so many books about the Beatles' business woes and come out, confused. I think we have it. I think we explain it in a rational way. But then the rest is, volume 1 goes up to 1973. It ends just after he's finished recording Band on the Run, and Band on the Run is released. And we had originally thought that that would be a good place to stop for that volume, because here we have this beginning where he's about to have a nervous breakdown because he doesn't know what he's going to do, and then you have albums that have come out and been criticized, and you've got the world splitting into the John and Paul camps, and Rolling Stone doing its thing, and then finally at the end he has a triumph with Band on the Run.
Right.
The problem was we wanted to take it up to the end of 73, and Band on the Run is released and the reviews are out and they're good, but the real triumph really takes place in 74, when it gets to the top of the charts twice, at least twice. Every time he puts out another single,
Right.
it goes back up, even though he was against putting out singles because he still had the Beatles attitude that albums and singles should be separate. That's why he didn't put Helen Wheels on the British Band on the Run, but put it on the American one because Al Khoury at Capitol talked him into it. And then Al Khoury talked him into releasing Jet. And all these things made that album the triumph it was. But the book ends sort of suggesting that there's going to be that triumph, but we're not there yet. And we're trying to not project into the future. We're trying to not say what we know will happen while we're writing about, it being on the way. which is something Mark did too in Tune In.
Exactly.
But it's a lot harder with Paul than it was with the Beatles, because first of all, we're going through his sessions and things, and a lot of the time during the entire session, a song has a different name than when it finally comes out on the disc. In fact, Mrs. Vanderbilt,
Hmm.
all through the sessions, was called Mrs. Vanderbilt. And we have to refer to it as Mrs. Vanderbilt with the R in the book until we get there. And then we have to explain that, we don't actually know why he changed it or whether it was a mistake that got past everybody and he's since just lived with it, you
Yeah,
know. So,
he took the R out. I
so
always wondered why.
yeah. Also, the other thing is that he would record a lot of tracks that he would put away and not use for a while. And probably the biggest example of that is going to come in volume 2, which we're working on now, which is My Carnival. My Carnival will have a bunch about him recording that, but it doesn't come out until some later volume in the series,
Hmm.
possibly the last volume. We are under contract for the first 2, so that takes us up to 1980. We'll end with the Japanese bust. We wanted to end with the end of Wings, but the end of Wings is so amorphous that, as of 1981, 82, theoretically Wings is still going. It wasn't really, it never really ended. I mean,
There was
it,
no big announcement about it.
there was no big announcement about it. There was an article. There was an article in the newspaper, one of the British music papers, that I think either Lawrence Juber or Steve Hawley saw and called Paul up and said, so this thing about Wings ending, I mean, are we? And Paul said, yeah, it was meaning to talk to you about that. So it just fizzled out more than
Yeah.
anything. I think, the Japanese bus may have had a lot to do with souring his ideas about the whole touring thing, and plus he was beginning to record stuff for McCartney too. So again, we have a book that's going to end that we thought would have a really sort of hard ending, and it doesn't quite. But so that will end with the Japanese bust, and I guess maybe him getting out. I'm not sure if we're going to end it with him still in jail, or because talking about a cliffhanger, you know. So volumes 3 and 4 will probably cover the rest of his life. We were thinking 5, but I had lunch with our publisher, and she said, "So how many volumes do you expect to go to?" And I said 5. And from the terrified look on her face, I began sort of. Adrian and I began talking about maybe it can be 4. So either this publisher will sign on for the next 2 once we've gotten through these, or we'll find a new publisher for the final ones, because we don't want to leave it halfway.
Yeah. It's got to be a tough decision. How much time do you devote to, well, the music should be the most important thing, but
Yeah,
depending upon what period you're talking about, what was going on in his private life, like
yeah,
leading up to Linda's death and the aftermath of that, and John's death too, and how that affected him.
right.
So there's so many other aspects here. How much time do you devote to each? But like I said, it should always be the music first.
Yeah,
That'll always be the most fascinating thing, at least for me anyway. But
yeah. We're thinking of it as a biography of his creative life, but because your creative life is intimately tied to your actual life, we are making it a full biography. So, we try to get in everything that we can that we know about what's going on in his life. But then when he goes in the studio, it sort of breaks into, okay, Monday, October, whatever, and then we talk about the session, in much greater detail than we talked about what he did last Saturday for lunch.
mhm, yeah,
Uh,
I
so
would expect that. I would
yeah.
want that. Yeah.
But as we go on, we think of it as a biography of his creative life. So we're going to end up with, the classical stuff, the painting, the books. Now we're going to have a musical. Um, so we're talking about really sort of a polymath here, or you might say a Renaissance guy. He's got his fingers in a lot of different flaming pies,
Yeah.
and we have to deal with all of it
And
because
how much time can you devote to his live performances? My God, he's toured constantly,
that
up
is a
until the pandemic, in this century, just
yeah.
every year, I think.
This is something we talk about all the time, even with volume 2, where we just have, a world tour and Wings Over America. Um, and well, we'll have the 79 performances too,
Hmm.
will be in there. And I don't think we can treat them with the same kind of detail as we do the studio sessions. We didn't in volume 1.
Hmm.
What we did is, um, in putting together each tour, he had certain things he wanted to do. Like the first European tour, he had a screen and they were showing films, and and they had that bus. And so we've talked to the people who reconfigured the bus for them. We talked to the people who put the film together, and the technical things involved with that. And then otherwise, if something unusual goes on in the set, we talk about that, or we talk about generally how the performance was received, um, in reviews, or sometimes there are, celebrities who were at the concerts who have something to say about their memory of it,
Hmm.
um, things like that. If there was something that went on after the concert at an after party, which sometimes there was. Excuse me. Um, there's some of those things turned into fairly, riotous evenings. And so, you have events that you can describe. But we don't, we're not going to have, Monday night he opened with, Eat at Home, and then
Hmm.
Tuesday night he opened with Eat at Home. We basically give what the set list is. And if there's something unusual that happens, like the end of the 1973 UK tour, they were touring with Brinsley Schwartz as their support band. And so when they did Long Tall Sally at the end, Brinsley Schwartz came out and performed it with them. So
Hmm.
that's obviously worth mentioning because it's not the same as the night before and every other night.
Yeah.
If there was, we talk about in the 73 tour, actually, we talk a lot about the different ways real audiences reacted during, the various stops, because different places in England have different kinds of
Hmm.
audiences. I mean, and he talked about that on the tour, so we were able to sort of reconstruct that. Yeah, this, we've come up with an incredible amount of detail that, if I say so myself, nobody else has put in one place, because
Hmm.
most of the books about Paul, even if they're this thick, you know this much of it is going to be about Paul with the Beatles, and then
Right.
his year career since then is in a couple of hundred pages. We didn't feel that was adequate. We did, and we felt that there was a need for someone to tell his actual story in detail. And we're hoping he'll be pleased with the details. Um, some he may, some he not may not. I don't know. It's possible if he reads volume 1 when it comes out, he'll say, "Okay, these guys are treating me seriously. Maybe I'll talk to them for the later volumes." Um, we'll see.
I hope that happens, but he's about to be 79. His time is pretty valuable.
That's
So for
true.
him to invest any time to read any book on him is saying a lot,
That's
you
true.
know. So yeah, one last thing, one of the many aspects of the Beatles' careers that I'm always fascinated in are the songs that they wrote for other people
Yeah. Yeah.
or performed on for other people. And with McCartney, you got everything from "Come and Get It" for Badfinger to "On the Wings of a Nightingale," for the Everly Brothers. Are you going to tackle any of that stuff too?
Yeah. In volume 1, I think we really only have 2 of them. I do discuss uh, the Badfinger one, because it's part of that. Last year we're talking about with the Beatles.
Hmm.
But the only other one I can think of offhand that's in volume one is Mine for Me that he did for Rod Stewart.
Okay.
You know, in fact, um, uh, we have the sort of a press conference he did where, you know, someone asked him about writing songs for people, and he said, "Yeah, you know, I mean, if Rod Stewart called me and wanted a song, I'd do it." And then, you know, guess what happened? Rod Stewart called, you know, and Mine for Me is, you know, I think it's overlooked by a lot of people, but it's a really good song,
Hmm.
and a really interesting song. And we know when he wrote it. We know, you know, a bit about it. We know that he actually came out and sang it once with Rod at one performance. Um,
Midnight Special.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Uh,
Um, and you know, so as that ramps up more, we'll get into that too. But you know, when we say his creative life, we mean everything that we, you know, can do. We don't, we don't want to skip a thing. Now, whether our editors will be happy with, you know, all of that, or will want to trim large sections, we don't know yet because they haven't done the editing on. You know, we haven't
hmm.
seen their editing yet. Anyway.
Well, since it's the same period, would you have tackled 6 o'clock for Ringo?
Oh yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I was thinking about totally non-Beatles things.
Yeah.
But yeah, we did six. Well, no, wait, we're not up to six.
It's 73.
Yeah,
So if you're covering through Ben on the Run, then you
we
have to.
did 6 o'clock, and that was the only one on that record, was it, or
The only
not?
one that Paul wrote.
Yeah, we did the sessions for that because Paul did go to the sessions, um, and you know, and in fact, Richard Perry had done some work on James Paul McCartney, and it was
I
like
wasn't
right,
aware of that. I didn't
yeah,
know he worked on that.
as right as they were finishing James Paul McCartney, uh, is when, you know, both Ringo and Richard Perry were sort of after Paul to do something for Ringo's album, and so Ringo came to London. You know, he'd done a lot of the album in L.A. He came to London to record 6 o'clock. Um, so yeah, yeah, we did get that one. Anything else that we might have?
Well, I'm thinking Mine for Me came out in 74.
Yeah, came out
Um, and he also wrote Let's Love for Peggy Lee,
right.
and that came out in 74, I
Yeah,
think. You know, 4th of July,
right.
you
We
know,
yeah, we're definitely doing that. We got a comment from guy who recorded it. What was his
John
name?
Christie.
John Christie. Yes. Um, and you know, but Mine for Me, it came out in '74, but he wrote it in '73.
Okay.
He wrote it kind of around the time he was writing Band on the Run stuff.
Hmm.
So yeah, so we have it in there, you know, him writing it, um, but we don't have the recording yet. But we'll get to that when it happens.
Hmm. Be
Yeah,
interesting to hear what you got on the McGear album.
a lot. We spoke to Mike McGear.
Uh-huh.
We've spoken to some of the engineers and other people involved. Um, we even spoke, Adrian spoke to a couple of the guys from 10cc because they basically were using their studio
Right.
and their the gizmo, I think they called it, which was a sort of an instrument they had concocted that Mike McGear used. So yeah, that will be obviously obviously close to the start of volume two,
Hmm.
since they start recording it in, you know, January '74. So well, actually, I say that, but there were a couple of tracks from it that were recorded in '73 that Paul oversaw, you know, with Mike, and actually one thing that they wrote together at Mike's house in Liverpool that we talk about that too. We have a bit about that visit, and you know, we got a lot of information from Mike that was handy.
Hmm.
So
Okay. So
yeah, that
what's
in a way that's sort of a hidden wings album, you know.
Oh, I've always looked at it that way. The same way that Splinter's album, you know, The
Mhm.
Place I Love, The Place I Live. It's very much a George Harrison album. It's got
Mhm.
George's fingerprints all over it, Same thing with McGear,
Mhm.
very much a McCartney album. You even have Denny Sywell on there and Jimmy McCulloch,
Yeah.
uh, yeah, as well. All right. So, when is the release date, at least as of this moment, for Volume One?
Sometime in, it sounds like the second half of 2022. Yeah. Tell me about it.
This is painful. This is Mark Lewis and painful.
But but we met our deadline. That's the difference. Mark's concept of deadlines is a lot more fluid than, I mean, I was a newspaper guy, so when
Hmm.
someone says to me deadline, it kind of means that, like, if you don't meet it, they're going to come and shoot you. But obviously, it's not that way for books. And
Hmm.
but we asked our editor, how serious is the deadline? And she said, yeah, we take deadlines seriously. But then we got it in on deadline, and we're still waiting for their edits. We'll see.
Okay. And there is a website for the book.
Yes. I don't remember this. It's probably McCartneyLegacy.com, but there is a Facebook page. There is a Facebook McCartney Legacy page, and probably the website will be listed on the Facebook page. I know that Adrian is doing the website, and I think he's just changed a lot of things around. So I'm not even sure if it's totally open right at the moment. But so check the Facebook page, and we'll put any news of publication dates and things that
Hmm.
we have up there.
All right. Well, this has been great, Alan, talking about the Beatles' peak and more
Yeah.
than we expected about the McCartney legacy. But hey, I'm looking forward to it. I can't wait for every volume to come out.
Me too.
So thanks for being here. And by all means, if you've never listened to things we said today, check us out. We're on podbean.com. We're on iTunes. We have a YouTube page you can subscribe to. And don't forget my other podcast show, Talk More Talk, a solo Beatles videocast. We have a YouTube page for that. That's on all platforms. And please subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so already. Alan, thanks so much for being here. And you're welcome back anytime.
Okay.
Give us a McCartney legacy update
Sure.
every few months. Thanks so much. And thanks to all of you for watching, and we'll see you next time.